19 black celebrities from the Golden Age whose smell makes people run away. What if I told you some of the greatest black music legends in history were secretly destroying themselves while the world applauded their talent? Behind the unforgettable hits, sold-out concerts, and larger-than-life fame were shocking stories of addiction, emotional breakdowns, violent tempers, loneliness, exhaustion, and lives slowly spiraling out of control. From Rick James and Sly Stone to Etta James, Richard Pryor, and Ike Turner, many of these stars battled demons far darker than fans ever imagined. Some lost their families, some lost their freedom, and others lost themselves completely behind the spotlight. Today, we're uncovering the painful truth behind music history's most troubled icons. Stay until the end because a few of these stories are absolutely heartbreaking. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below on Remembered Lives channel. Rick James. Rick James was the definition of excess, a funk superstar who lived every day as if rules simply did not apply to him. Born in Buffalo, New York in 1948, Rick exploded onto the music scene during the late 1970s and early 1980s with massive hits like Super Freak, Give It To Me Baby, and Cold Blooded. His album Street Songs sold millions of copies and transformed him into one of the biggest black music icons of his era. On stage, he looked fearless, braided hair, leather outfits, wild energy, and non-stop confidence. But behind the spotlight was a man slowly losing control of his life. Rick openly embraced drugs, alcohol, and non-stop partying. Cocaine addiction became a major part of his world, affecting both his behavior and physical health. Friends and musicians who worked around him often described chaotic backstage environments filled with cigarette smoke, sweat, alcohol, and sleepless nights. Rick treated that lifestyle almost like part of his artistic identity, believing real funk should feel dangerous and unpredictable. As the years passed, the addiction worsened. Legal problems, violent incidents, and prison time during the 1990s badly damaged his reputation. Yet, despite the scandals, his musical influence never disappeared. Younger artists constantly sampled his music, and Super Freak became immortal again through hip-hop culture. Rick James died in 2004 at only 56 years old. What makes his story so tragic is that behind the wild personality and outrageous confidence stood a deeply troubled man, consumed by addiction, loneliness, and self-destruction, while still trying to entertain the world. Sly Stone. Sly Stone was one of the most revolutionary figures in funk and soul music, a creative genius whose sound changed American music forever. Born Sylvester Stewart in Texas in 1943 and raised in California, Sly became famous as the leader of Sly and the Family Stone, one of the first major interracial and mixed-gender bands in modern music history. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, songs like Everyday People, Family Affair, and Dance to the Music transformed him into a cultural icon whose music blended funk, soul, rock, and psychedelic energy into something completely new. At first, Sly represented freedom, unity, and optimism. His performances felt electric, chaotic, and joyful all at once. But behind the groundbreaking music was a man slowly collapsing under the pressure of fame addiction and emotional instability. By the early 1970s, cocaine and PCP addiction had begun taking over his life. Friends and bandmates described him disappearing for days, skipping concerts, locking himself inside dark rooms, and becoming increasingly paranoid. During recording sessions for the legendary album There's a Riot Going On, Sly isolated himself for long periods while surrounded by drugs, smoke, exhaustion, and emotional confusion. His appearance and personal habits became increasingly neglected as addiction worsened. The once charismatic leader who inspired millions slowly turned into a symbol of self-destruction. As the years passed, lawsuits, financial problems, homelessness, rumors, and health struggles followed him constantly. Yet despite the chaos, Sly Stone's influence on music never disappeared. Artists across funk, hip-hop, pop, and R&B continued sampling and studying his work decades later. What makes Sly Stone's story so heartbreaking is the contrast between the joy in his music and the pain in his real life. Behind the revolutionary sound stood a lonely genius, consumed by addiction, isolation, and the heavy cost of carrying a level of creativity few people truly understood. James Brown. James Brown was more than a music star. He was a force of nature. Known worldwide as the godfather of soul, Brown transformed American music through explosive performances, relentless discipline, and unmatched energy on stage. Born into extreme poverty in South Carolina in 1933, he survived a brutal childhood filled with hunger, violence, and hardship, before rising to become one of the most influential entertainers in history. Songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, I Got You, and It's a Man's World helped shape soul, funk, and modern pop music for generations. On stage, James Brown performed with superhuman intensity. Night after night, he danced, screamed, sweated, and collapsed dramatically while audiences exploded with excitement. But behind the greatness was a man obsessed with control and perfection. Band members often feared him because he demanded absolute discipline and punished mistakes harshly during performances. At the same time, Brown's personal life became increasingly troubled. Multiple marriages collapsed, legal problems followed him for decades, and drug addiction slowly affected his behavior during later years. Friends described periods where he became paranoid, emotionally unstable, and difficult to work with, as fame and pressure consumed more of his life. His non-stop performing lifestyle also damaged his physical health. Even into old age, Brown refused to slow down, treating every concert like a battle he needed to win. The sweat-soaked suits and relentless stage routines became part of his legend because he believed true soul music required total sacrifice. James Brown died on Christmas Day in 2006 at the age of 73. What makes his story so emotional is that behind the confidence and unstoppable energy stood a man shaped by pain, poverty, pressure, and loneliness. The world saw a fearless superstar, but beneath the spotlight was someone who spent his entire life fighting to outrun the struggles he carried since childhood. Old Dirty Bastard. Old Dirty Bastard was one of the most unpredictable and chaotic figures hip-hop ever produced. A man whose personality was so wild that even his closest friends often had no idea what he would do next. Born Russell Tyrone Jones in Brooklyn in 1968, ODB became famous as a founding member of the legendary Wu-Tang Clan during the 1990s. While other rappers focused on polished images, Old Dirty Bastard built his career on complete unpredictability. His raw voice, bizarre humor, and reckless energy made songs like Shimmy Shimmy Ya unforgettable pieces of hip-hop history. But behind the outrageous personality was a man spiraling deeper into addiction and self-destruction. Drug abuse became a major part of his life, affecting his health, relationships, and career. Stories about missed concerts, arrests, erratic behavior, and poor living conditions followed him constantly throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s. Friends described him as both lovable and deeply troubled, someone capable of making people laugh one moment and frightening them the next. His appearance often reflected the chaos surrounding him. Long periods of partying, unstable living situations, and addiction led to neglect of both his health and hygiene. Yet many fans strangely embraced that rawness because ODB represented authenticity in a music industry becoming increasingly commercialized. He did not pretend to be perfect. He looked and behaved like someone openly fighting demons in public. Despite the turmoil, his talent remained undeniable. ODB brought energy and personality to Wu-Tang Clan that nobody else could replace. But physically and emotionally, the years of addiction were destroying him. On November 13, 2004, Old Dirty Bastard collapsed inside a New York recording studio and died from a drug overdose at only 35 years old. His death shocked hip-hop fans worldwide because beneath the madness was a gifted artist many believed still had more to give. What makes ODB's story so heartbreaking is that behind the humor and chaos stood a man consumed by addiction, instability, and emotional pain, while millions watched his downfall happen in real time. Ike Turner. Ike Turner was one of the most influential yet controversial figures in music history, a man whose genius helped shape early rock and soul, while his personal behavior destroyed much of his reputation. Born in Mississippi in 1931, Ike became a pioneering musician, songwriter, and producer, long before rock music exploded into mainstream America. Many historians even credit his 1951 recording Rocket 88 as one of the earliest rock and roll songs ever created. During the 1960s and 1970s, Ike achieved worldwide fame through the Ike and Tina Turner Revue. Together with Tina Turner, he created explosive performances and classic songs that electrified audiences everywhere. On stage, Ike appeared disciplined, talented, and in total control. But behind the scenes, his life was collapsing under addiction, violence, and emotional instability. Cocaine addiction especially transformed Ike during the 1970s. Friends and musicians described him spending endless nights awake inside recording studios, surrounded by smoke, alcohol, sweat, and paranoia. His appearance became increasingly exhausted and neglected as the addiction worsened. At the same time, his abusive treatment of Tina Turner eventually became one of the darkest stories in entertainment history, after she publicly revealed years of violence and emotional torment inside their marriage. As the years passed, Ike's career suffered heavily from legal troubles, drug arrests, financial problems, and public backlash. Although he later attempted a comeback and even won renewed musical respect during the 1990s, the shadow of addiction and abuse followed him permanently. Ike Turner died in 2007 at the age of 76 from complications linked to drug use and long-term health problems. What makes his story so tragic is the contradiction between talent and destruction. Behind the musical genius stood a deeply damaged man whose addiction, violence, and inner demons ultimately overshadowed much of the brilliance he brought to American music history. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was one of the most fearless and influential comedians in American history, a man who transformed pain, addiction, trauma, and racial tension into brutally honest comedy that changed entertainment forever. Born in Illinois in 1940, Pryor grew up surrounded by violence, poverty, prostitution, and emotional chaos inside his grandmother's brothel. Those experiences scarred him deeply, but they also gave him the raw honesty that later made him legendary. During the 1970s and 1980s, Pryor became one of the biggest stars in comedy through groundbreaking stand-up specials and hit films like Silver Streak, Stir Crazy, and See No Evil, Hear No Evil. Audiences loved him because he spoke openly about subjects many entertainers feared touching: racism, addiction, relationships, depression, and self-destruction. On stage, he was brilliant, unpredictable, and emotionally explosive. But behind the laughter was a man slowly collapsing under drug addiction and emotional pain. Pryor struggled heavily with cocaine and alcohol abuse for years, especially during the late 1970s. Friends described him arriving on sets exhausted, disoriented, surrounded by cigarette smoke, dirty clothes, and the physical signs of non-stop partying and emotional breakdown. His home life became increasingly chaotic as addiction consumed his health and relationships. Then came one of the most shocking moments in Hollywood history. In 1980, during a severe drug crisis, Pryor set himself on fire while freebasing cocaine and ran burning down a Los Angeles street before collapsing. He survived with terrible injuries, but the incident became a horrifying symbol of how far addiction had taken him. Despite everything, Pryor continued performing and creating unforgettable comedy. Even while battling multiple sclerosis later in life, he remained respected as one of the greatest comedians of all time. Richard Pryor died in 2005 at the age of 65. What makes his story so heartbreaking is the contrast between the laughter he gave the world and the suffering he carried privately. Behind the genius and humor stood a man fighting addiction, trauma, loneliness, and emotional scars that fame could never erase. Miles Davis. Miles Davis was one of the greatest musical innovators of the 20th century, a jazz genius who reinvented modern music over and over again. Born in Illinois in 1926, Miles became famous through legendary albums like Kind of Blue and Bitches Brew, changing the sound of jazz forever with his cool, emotional trumpet style. Unlike many artists who repeated the same formula, Miles constantly evolved, pushing music into new directions, even when critics doubted him. But behind the brilliance was a man battling addiction pain and emotional isolation for much of his life. During the 1950s, Miles struggled heavily with heroin addiction, before later facing cocaine and alcohol problems during different periods of his career. Friends often described him as intense, distant, and emotionally unpredictable. His obsession with perfection made relationships difficult, and several marriages collapsed under the pressure of fame and substance abuse. By the late 1960s and 1970s, Miles had become increasingly isolated while recording experimental music deep into the night. Studio sessions were often filled with smoke, exhaustion, tension, and emotional pressure as Miles pushed musicians beyond their limits, searching for sounds nobody had heard before. His health also began declining due to years of addiction and physical stress. Even during his darkest moments, however, Miles Davis remained fearless creatively. He refused to become comfortable or nostalgic, constantly reinventing himself while influencing generations of musicians across jazz, rock, funk, and hip-hop. Miles Davis died in 1991 at the age of 65. What makes his story so emotional is the contrast between his genius and his suffering. Behind the cool image and timeless music stood a lonely perfectionist, carrying addiction, emotional pain, and exhaustion, while trying to create something immortal. John Lee Hooker. John Lee Hooker carried the sound of the Mississippi Delta inside his voice, a slow, hypnotic blues style that influenced generations of musicians across blues, rock, and soul music. Born in Mississippi around 1917, Hooker grew up during an era of extreme poverty and racial segregation, before eventually bringing his music north to Detroit. There, his deep voice and raw guitar playing helped create classics like Boom Boom Boogie Chillin' and One Bourbon, One Scotch, One Beer. Unlike flashy performers, Hooker built his legend through simplicity and emotional realism. His songs sounded like late-night loneliness, exhaustion, heartbreak, and survival. Fans connected with him because he never appeared polished or artificial. He looked like a man who had truly lived the struggles he sang about. During the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, life on the road was brutal for black blues musicians. Endless travel, smoky clubs, poor hotels, cigarette-filled bars, sweat-soaked performances, and financial exploitation became part of everyday survival. Hooker spent decades moving from one club to another, often sleeping little, while carrying the emotional and physical pressure of constantly performing. Friends described him as quiet, private, and deeply independent, someone more comfortable with a guitar than with fame itself. As he aged, Hooker's rough appearance and worn clothing became part of his blues image. He represented authenticity rather than glamour, and many fans admired that raw honesty. Yet behind the legendary reputation was a man who had endured hardship for most of his life, before finally receiving widespread recognition later in his career. By the 1980s and 1990s, younger rock musicians openly praised him as one of the creators of modern blues music. Even after decades of struggle, Hooker continued performing well into old age, because music remained inseparable from his identity. John Lee Hooker died in 2001 at the age of 83. What makes his story so emotional is that behind the cool blues image stood a man shaped by poverty, exhaustion, loneliness, and survival, while helping create some of the most influential music America has ever produced. Prince. Prince was one of the most mysterious and gifted artists in music history, a performer whose talent seemed almost beyond human. Born Prince Rogers Nelson in Minneapolis in 1958, he became a global superstar through legendary albums like Purple Rain, 1999, and Sign of the Times. Unlike most artists, Prince wrote, produced, arranged, and played multiple instruments himself, creating a unique sound that blended funk, rock, soul, pop, and R&B into something completely original. On stage, Prince looked untouchable, stylish, seductive, disciplined, and endlessly creative. But behind the genius was a man carrying deep emotional isolation and physical pain. Prince became famous for working obsessively, sometimes recording music for days without proper sleep, while demanding perfection from everyone around him. Friends described him as intensely private, cautious, and emotionally guarded, despite his enormous fame. Years of non-stop performances also severely damaged his body. His explosive stage routines caused chronic hip pain that reportedly became worse over time. Although Prince rarely spoke publicly about suffering, many close to him believed he quietly endured serious physical discomfort while continuing to perform night after night. At the same time, loneliness often surrounded his personal life. Despite relationships and marriages, Prince remained emotionally difficult to fully understand. He protected his privacy so carefully that even longtime collaborators admitted they never truly knew him completely. Then, tragedy shocked the music world in April 2016. Prince was found dead inside his Paisley Park home at only 57 years old. Authorities later confirmed he died from an accidental fentanyl overdose connected to pain medication. Fans around the world were devastated because Prince always appeared almost superhuman, disciplined, spiritual, and creatively unstoppable. What makes his story so heartbreaking is the realization that behind the brilliance, style, and mystery stood a man quietly battling pain, exhaustion, and isolation, while carrying the pressure of being a musical genius for decades. George Clinton. George Clinton was one of the wildest creative minds in music history. A man who transformed funk into an entire universe filled with bizarre costumes, psychedelic energy, and revolutionary sound. Born in North Carolina in 1941 and raised in New Jersey, Clinton became the mastermind behind Parliament Funkadelic, creating classics like Flashlight, One Nation Under a Groove, and Give Up the Funk. During the 1970s, his music helped redefine Black culture, influencing generations of artists from hip-hop to modern R&B. On stage, George Clinton looked almost otherworldly. Colorful wigs, chaotic performances, smoke-filled stages, and futuristic characters became part of the P-Funk experience. But behind the genius and eccentric image was a man living inside non-stop chaos. Endless touring, sleepless nights, drugs, cigarettes, alcohol, and overwhelming pressure became part of daily life during the height of Parliament Funkadelic's success. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, cocaine addiction and financial problems were seriously affecting Clinton's life. Friends and musicians described backstage environments that felt completely out of control, with exhaustion, sweat, smoke, and emotional burnout everywhere around the group. George himself often looked physically drained after years of non-stop touring and studio work. Yet he kept pushing forward because creativity consumed him completely. At the same time, legal battles over music rights and money haunted him for decades. Despite helping shape modern funk music, Clinton spent years fighting financial exploitation and industry manipulation that nearly destroyed his career. Yet even through addiction and chaos, younger artists continued worshiping him as one of music's greatest innovators. George Clinton survived where many others from his era did not. What makes his story so emotional is that behind the outrageous costumes and wild performances stood a brilliant but exhausted artist, carrying the pressure of constantly reinventing music while battling addiction, financial struggles, and the heavy cost of genius. Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters was one of the founding fathers of modern blues, a man whose raw sound helped shape rock music, soul, and even heavy metal decades later. Born McKinley Morganfield in Mississippi in 1913, Muddy grew up working on plantations in the Deep South before bringing Delta blues into Chicago's electric music scene during the 1940s. Songs like Hoochie Coochie Man, Manish Boy, and Got My Mojo Working turned him into one of the most influential musicians in American history. Unlike glamorous entertainers, Muddy Waters represented survival. His deep voice, rough appearance, and powerful stage presence reflected years of poverty, racial hardship, physical labor, and endless touring through smoky clubs and dangerous roads across America. Fans admired him because he looked real, not polished, not manufactured, but shaped directly by hardship and experience. Life for black blues musicians during that era was brutal. Long drives, poor hotels, cigarette smoke, sweat-filled bars, whiskey, and exhausting performances became normal parts of everyday life. Muddy spent decades traveling constantly while fighting discrimination and financial exploitation inside the music industry. Friends often described him as tough, disciplined, and emotionally guarded because survival demanded strength. By the 1960s and 1970s, younger British rock stars like the Rolling Stones openly credited Muddy Waters for inspiring them. Yet despite his influence, years of hard living had already damaged his health. Smoking, exhaustion, and non-stop performing slowly weakened his body as he aged. Muddy Waters died in 1983 at the age of 68. What makes his story so powerful is that behind the legendary blues image stood a man who endured poverty, racism, physical exhaustion, and emotional hardship while helping create the foundation of modern popular music itself. B.B. King. B.B. King was one of the most respected and beloved figures in blues history, a musician whose guitar could express sadness, loneliness, and emotional pain with just a few notes. Born Riley B. King in Mississippi in 1925, he grew up picking cotton during the harsh years of the Great Depression before eventually becoming known worldwide as the King of the Blues. With timeless songs like The Thrill Is Gone, B.B. transformed blues music into something deeply emotional, yet accessible to audiences around the world. Unlike many flashy performers, B.B. King built his legacy through sincerity. His voice sounded warm and wounded at the same time, while his famous guitar, Lucille, became almost like a second voice speaking directly from his soul. But behind the gentle smile and elegant stage presence was a man who spent decades living an exhausting life on the road. For years, B.B. performed over 250 concerts annually, traveling constantly through smoky clubs, sleepless nights, cheap hotels, and endless highways. That non-stop schedule wore heavily on his body and personal life. Multiple marriages failed under the pressure of fame and constant touring, leaving him emotionally isolated, despite worldwide admiration. Friends often described him as lonely off-stage, a man who felt most comfortable while performing. At the same time, years of diabetes and physical exhaustion slowly damaged his health. Yet even into old age, B.B. refused to stop touring, because music was the center of his entire identity. Fans admired him not only for his talent, but for the dignity and kindness he showed throughout his career. B.B. King died in 2015 at the age of 89. What makes his story so emotional is the contrast between the comfort he gave audiences and the loneliness he often carried himself. Behind the legendary guitar and warm smile stood a man shaped by hardship, exhaustion, and sacrifice, while helping create the emotional foundation of modern blues music. Little Richard. Little Richard was one of the most explosive and revolutionary performers music had ever seen. A man whose energy helped create rock and roll itself. Born Richard Penniman in Georgia in 1932, he broke into mainstream America during the 1950s with unforgettable hits like Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly Miss Molly. His screaming vocals, pounding piano, wild hair, and outrageous stage presence shocked audiences and completely changed popular music forever. At a time when many black artists were forced to appear polished and restrained, Little Richard exploded onto stages with unmatched energy and flamboyance. Audiences had never seen anything like him. Behind the makeup, however, was a man carrying enormous emotional conflict and loneliness throughout much of his life. Richard struggled deeply with identity, religion, fame, and sexuality for decades. Raised in a strict religious environment, he often felt torn between his spiritual beliefs and the lifestyle surrounding rock and roll fame. During certain periods, he walked away from music entirely to focus on religion, believing fame and excess were destroying him emotionally. The non-stop touring lifestyle also became exhausting. Cigarette smoke, sweaty clubs, endless performances and chaotic nightlife followed him across America during the harsh early days of rock music. Despite becoming a legend, Richard often felt underappreciated because many white artists who copied his style achieved greater financial success and mainstream recognition. Yet even through frustration and personal conflict, Little Richard remained unforgettable. Nearly every major rock artist who followed, from the Beatles to Prince, acknowledged his influence. Little Richard died in 2020 at the age of 87. What makes his story so powerful is that behind the loud performances and fearless image stood a deeply emotional man, battling loneliness, identity struggles, spiritual conflict, and the heavy burden of changing music history forever. Cab Calloway. Cab Calloway was one of the most charismatic entertainers of the Harlem Renaissance, a performer whose energy, humor, and unforgettable voice made him a giant of jazz history. Born in New York in 1907 and raised in Baltimore, Calloway became famous during the 1930s through legendary performances at the Cotton Club in Harlem. Songs like Minnie the Moocher turned him into a national sensation, while his wild dance moves, zoot suits, and booming "Heidi-ho" catchphrase made him unlike anyone audiences had ever seen. Behind the glamorous stage image, however, was a man surviving the brutal realities of life for black entertainers during segregation-era America. Cab spent decades traveling through smoky nightclubs, crowded theaters, exhausting train rides, and racially divided cities, while constantly performing to maintain success. Long nights, cigarette-filled venues, sweat-soaked costumes, and non-stop touring became part of his daily life for years. Despite his polished appearance on stage, friends often described the entertainment world around him as physically exhausting and emotionally draining. Musicians from that era rarely enjoyed comfort or stability while traveling. Yet Cab continued performing with incredible style and professionalism because entertaining audiences became his identity and survival. As younger musical styles emerged during the 1950s and 1960s, Calloway struggled at times to maintain the same spotlight he once dominated. Still, his influence never disappeared. Generations of artists later borrowed from his stage energy, theatrical style, and larger-than-life personality. Cab Calloway died in 1994 at the age of 86. What makes his story so emotional is that behind the joyful performances and elegant image stood a man who endured exhaustion, racial barriers, and decades of pressure while helping build the foundation of Black American entertainment history. Screamin' Jay Hawkins. Screamin' Jay Hawkins was one of the strangest and most unforgettable performers music had ever seen. A singer whose theatrical, horror-style performances shocked audiences long before shock rock even existed. Born in Ohio in 1929, Hawkins became famous through the haunting classic "I Put a Spell on You," a song whose wild screams and emotional intensity made him instantly unforgettable. Unlike polished entertainers of the 1950s, Screamin' Jay built his career around chaos and fear. He appeared on stage rising from coffins, carrying skulls, wearing capes, and performing with smoke snakes and bizarre props that terrified and fascinated audiences at the same time. Many people thought his image was outrageous, but Hawkins understood that standing out was the only way to survive inside the entertainment industry. Behind the wild stage persona, however, was a man struggling financially and emotionally for much of his life. Constant touring through small clubs, cigarette smoke, alcohol-filled venues, and exhausting nightlife became normal parts of his world. Friends described him as humorous but deeply unpredictable, someone whose personal life often felt as chaotic as his performances. As music trends changed, Hawkins never achieved the same commercial success as many artists he later influenced. Yet, musicians from rock, blues, heavy metal, and punk openly credited him as a pioneer whose theatrical style inspired generations of performers. Screamin' Jay Hawkins died in 2000 at the age of 70. What makes his story so emotional is that behind the frightening image and outrageous performances stood a creative outsider, constantly fighting for recognition, while carrying loneliness and instability throughout much of his life. Howlin Wolf. Howlin Wolf was one of the most powerful and intimidating figures in blues history. A man whose voice sounded less like singing and more like pure human pain, roaring out of the Mississippi Delta. Born Chester Burnett in 1910, Wolf grew up working brutal plantation fields before becoming one of Chicago blues' greatest legends. Towering over 6 feet tall, with a thunderous voice and frightening stage presence, he transformed songs like Smokestack Lightning, Spoonful, and Killing Floor into timeless blues classics. Unlike polished entertainers of his era, Howlin Wolf looked and sounded raw, exhausted, and completely real. Years of poverty, hard labor, heavy smoking, and non-stop touring shaped both his music and his physical presence. Friends and musicians often described him as intimidating, but deeply disciplined, someone who carried the emotional weight of Southern black life inside every performance. During the 1950s and 1960s, Wolf toured relentlessly through smoky clubs and dangerous roads while facing racism, financial exploitation, and physical exhaustion. Long nights filled with cigarettes, whiskey, sweat, and sleepless travel became normal parts of life for blues musicians of that era. Wolf's rough appearance and strong body odor later became part of blues mythology because fans connected it to authenticity and survival rather than glamour. But beneath the powerful image was a man carrying enormous physical pain. Years of smoking and harsh living seriously damaged his health, leading to kidney problems and heart disease later in life. Still, Wolf continued performing because music was the only life he truly understood. Howlin Wolf died in 1976 at the age of 65. What makes his story so emotional is that behind the terrifying voice and giant presence stood a man who survived poverty, racism, exhaustion, and physical suffering while helping create the foundation of modern blues and rock music. Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack lived one of the most turbulent and emotionally painful lives in soul music history. Born in Cleveland in 1944, Womack first rose to fame alongside his brothers in the Womack Brothers before eventually becoming a solo star with classics like Across 110th Street, If You Think You're Lonely Now, and Woman's Gotta Have It. His voice carried raw, emotional pain that made listeners believe every word he sang. But behind the talent was constant tragedy and controversy. After the murder of Sam Cooke in 1964, Bobby shocked the music world by marrying Cooke's widow only months later, damaging his reputation permanently with many fans. At the same time, addiction and emotional instability slowly began taking over his life. During the 1970s and 1980s, cocaine abuse heavily affected Womack's health, appearance, and relationships. Friends described periods where he isolated himself, neglected his well-being, and struggled emotionally, while surrounded by smoke-filled studios, exhaustion, and personal chaos. His life became filled with heartbreak, family loss, financial problems, and guilt that followed him for decades. Yet despite everything, Bobby continued making deeply emotional music that connected strongly with audiences, because his pain sounded real. Many listeners believed songs like If You Think You're Lonely Now felt so powerful because Womack truly understood loneliness himself. Bobby Womack died in 2014 at the age of 70 after years of declining health. What makes his story so heartbreaking is that behind the soulful voice stood a man haunted by addiction, grief, controversy, and emotional suffering, while still trying to turn his pain into music that millions would never forget. Wilson Pickett. Wilson Pickett was one of the fiercest and most explosive voices soul music ever produced. A singer whose raw energy helped define the sound of Southern soul during the 1960s and 1970s. Born in Alabama in 1941 and raised in Detroit, Pickett grew up surrounded by poverty, violence, and emotional hardship before transforming himself into a music legend. Songs like Mustang Sally, In the Midnight Hour, and Land of 1,000 Dances made him famous for his aggressive vocals, emotional intensity, and wild stage performances that could electrify entire crowds within seconds. Unlike smoother soul singers of his era, Wilson sounded dangerous, emotional, and completely unpredictable. His voice carried anger, passion, heartbreak, and survival all at once. Audiences loved that rawness because it felt authentic. But behind the powerful performances was a man struggling with deep emotional instability and personal chaos for much of his life. Years of non-stop touring through smoky clubs, exhausting road schedules, alcohol-filled nights, and constant pressure slowly affected Pickett's physical and mental health. Friends and musicians often described him as intense and difficult to control, especially during later years when substance abuse and emotional stress became more visible. Legal troubles, violent incidents, and unstable behavior repeatedly damaged his reputation throughout the 1980s and 1990s. At the same time, Wilson often appeared lonely behind the scenes, despite his fame. Several relationships collapsed under the pressure of his unpredictable lifestyle, and many people close to him believed he struggled carrying unresolved anger from childhood trauma and years inside the harsh music industry. Yet even during difficult periods, Pickett's voice never lost its emotional power. Whenever he stepped onto a stage, audiences could still feel the fire that made him one of soul music's greatest performers. Wilson Pickett died in 2006 at the age of 64 after years of declining health. What makes his story so emotional is that behind the fearless image and explosive music stood a deeply troubled man battling inner pain, addiction, exhaustion, and loneliness, while giving soul music some of its most unforgettable performances. Etta James. Etta James possessed one of the most emotional and powerful voices in music history, a singer capable of turning pain into something hauntingly beautiful. Born in Los Angeles in 1938, Etta grew up without stability, facing abandonment, abuse, and emotional hardship from childhood. Those experiences shaped the raw emotion that later made songs like At Last I'd Rather Go Blind and Tell Mama timeless classics. Unlike polished pop stars, Etta's voice sounded deeply lived in. Every lyric carried heartbreak, exhaustion, longing, and emotional honesty that audiences immediately believed. During the 1960s and 1970s, she became one of the defining voices of blues, soul, and R&B music. But behind the incredible talent was a woman fighting constant inner battles. Drug addiction became one of the darkest parts of Etta's life. Heroin abuse during the late 1960s and 1970s severely damaged both her health and career. Friends described chaotic periods filled with sleepless nights, emotional breakdowns, neglected health, cigarette smoke, and personal isolation. Addiction led to arrests, rehabilitation attempts, and years where her music career nearly disappeared completely. At the same time, Etta struggled emotionally with relationships, trust, and self-worth because of the trauma she carried since childhood. Fame brought success, but it never fully healed the pain inside her. Yet even during her darkest years, Etta continued performing with astonishing emotional power. Many fans believed her music became even more heartbreaking because the suffering inside it was completely real. By the 1990s and 2000s, Etta experienced a career revival and finally received broader recognition for her enormous influence on American music. Still, years of addiction and health problems had already taken a serious physical toll. Etta James died in 2012 at the age of 73. What makes her story so heartbreaking is the contrast between the beauty of her voice and the pain she carried throughout life. Behind the legendary songs stood a woman fighting addiction, loneliness, trauma, and emotional scars, while still giving the world music filled with honesty and soul. Behind the fame, legendary music, and unforgettable performances were stories filled with addiction, exhaustion, loneliness, emotional breakdowns, and lives slowly falling apart behind closed doors. From Rick James and Sly Stone to Etta James, Wilson Pickett, and Old Dirty Bastard, many of these icons spent years battling personal demons while still entertaining millions of fans around the world. Some struggled with drugs, others with trauma, depression, violent tempers, or the crushing pressure of fame itself. Yet, despite the chaos, their music continues living on, because the pain inside their voices was real. But which legend do you believe had the most tragic downfall of all? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join Remembered Lives channel for more untold stories behind legendary Black artists.